Good evening, everybody. I'm still Tim Lynch. I'm Zooming today from Ivanhoe, the land of the Wurundjeri, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Yeah, a very good evening to Professor Griffith, who's joining us from Macedon. We'll crack on with the questions, and I'd echo what Britt has told us, that please do feel free to either raise your hand and ask the question verbally, or to put one into the chat box. I'm becoming more adept with each time we do this at fielding the questions, and I'm delighted to see questions appear there. Tom, you gave us a terrific lecture on the tyranny of distance. Let me start by asking the question that I ask to kickstart every Q&A. Can you restate this book's claim to greatness?
Certainly. Well, hello, Tim, and hello, everyone. It's lovely to join you this evening. Yes, well, although I admire the Tyranny of Distance, it probably wouldn't have been my nomination for one of the great books in the 2020 series. I think it's a contestable claim, its greatness. It's good that we should discuss that. I might have nominated maybe Eleanor Dark's The Timeless Land, or Inga Clendinen's Dancing with Strangers, or Grace Karsken's The Colony. They're three good examples of really outstanding historical scholarship that's changed the way we see our country. Or if I was thinking beyond our country to our region, I might have nominated Greg Denning's Islands and Beaches. Greg was a colleague of Geoffrey Blainey's, and I think much more influential as a teacher and scholar in many ways. However, we're talking about the Tyranny of Distance and Geoffrey Blainey, and I do admire the book, and I think it does have claims to greatness. And what are they? Well, of course, the title, End of the Language, that is a pretty great achievement in itself. It sort of signals the enduring significance of this book. It was a bestseller. Geoffrey Blainey wrote a book that sold about 200,000 copies. A best-selling Australian author of history. This is a great achievement. The book has, and his work as a whole has, great literary flair. Everyone agrees with that. This man can write, and writes with great pizzazz and style and insight. So just the literary qualities of the book, I think, we'd have to put up there in terms of its claims to greatness. And of course, when we consider the single book of an author, of such a prolific author, we have to consider it perhaps as part of the landscape of his oeuvre. And so it would be worth choosing, I think, any book of Geoffrey Blainey's, just to enable us to talk about his work as a whole and to consider his life as a historian. He's now 90. He's just written a memoir of the first 40 years of his life. He's unquestionably been one of the major historians of the 20th century, early 21st century in Australia. So I'd say one of his claims to greatness, you might say, and the book's claim would be to say that Blainey is, alongside Manning Clark, I think, would be one of those historians, perhaps just two of them really, in the last half century, who really became political figures as well as historians. And they were political figures because they were historians. So there are some of the reasons we might, I'm sure we'll get into other reasons as well about the stature of the book itself, but maybe some of the reasons why we would want to have this book as to be discussed in this series.
Thank you. Tom, I found the book terrific in terms of its readability. It's so unfashionable given current fashions. I wonder how far it still has resonance because it's seen as controversial more than it has an endurance because it was right.
Yes, well, I think when I returned to reading this book for this discussion, I was struck by how Geoffrey Blainey, I think, likes controversy. I think he courts controversy, and I think looking back, we know that in the 1980s he became a controversial political figure, partly because of his comments on immigration, but other issues as well. But when we look at the Tyranny of Distance with hindsight, I think we can discern a figure who is aiming to be controversial, by which I mean that he really positions his arguments against the mainstream of the historical profession. Tyranny of Distance does this all the time. It's aiming to saying something new. It is suggesting that its major insights have been overlooked by others. And so I think it's not as controversial as the author claims it to be, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It certainly found itself in the midst of controversy, particularly about the origins of British colonisation of Australia, but many of its insights were conventional insights. This was a book written out of those post-war years when Australia still, in many ways, in the early 1960s, this is Menzies Australia, still looking to a distant England as a kind of home, or at least as the centre of an empire, of which we were still in some ways a colony. And the book really wrestles with that, and it's disturbed in some ways by the decolonisation going on in the 1960s, by the fact that Australia is sort of drifting, if you like, in the Pacific, finding a new ally in America and going into some kind of other geopolitical sphere. And so I think it's very much, as I said in the lecture, I feel that the book styles itself as being radical, but I don't think it is quite as radical as Geoffrey claims. I think that's his style as a historian, to claim to be more radical and distinct than he really is. He sets up straw people in order to fashion his own difference. But I think the book is very much of the 1960s, very much of that post-war era of optimism about science and technology, about transport. This is the space era is underway, of course. And I think Blainey's writing into that sort of post-war optimism about science and technology. But as I think I've tried to suggest in the lecture, I think he's about to find that world is going to be destabilised by some new sensibilities and some new politics that he wasn't happy with.
Thanks, Tom. Peter McPhee has a question. Peter, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thanks, Tim. Tom, thanks very much for a wonderful lecture. It really was superb. I was very struck by the fact that Blainey ended the book with the Second World War. And I just wondered whether for a small boy born in 1930, that the experience of that war and of the fall of Singapore, the shifting of alliances towards the United States, and the way that he concludes the book by talking about Australia drifting sort of aimlessly, whether that experience of the war had a formative effect on a little boy and led him to think of an Australia that was so far away. And as he keeps on pointing out that Melbourne and Sydney are much further from Asia than people would like to think, but he does have this very strong image of a nation adrift, which I think comes from the war. Do you think that those years as a boy during the war might have been very influential?
Yes, I'm sure they must have been. And hello, Peter, and thank you for your comment and your question. And by the way, I loved your own lecture in this series. I think that's true that that Geoffrey's, we can now kind of assess this a little better now that we have a memoir of Jeff's about those first 40 years or so. And growing up in country Victoria was a great influence on his thinking. I think it's part of his originality. He returns constantly to those country folk who were massively transformed and destabilised by not just the Second World War, but by the post-war acceleration of change. I think he does hark back very often to those pre-war years. An example would be his book, Black Kettle and Full Moon, which is a really charming analysis of material life in country Australia from about 1852, the war years, and which he feels this is a vanished Australia. Perhaps that's the Australia of his childhood or just before his childhood. And in his later politics, he's often lamenting that other historians, perhaps people of my generation, don't sufficiently appreciate the good things, the positive things, the triumphs of that era into which he was born. That this is his three cheers view of history, as he calls it, as opposed to the black armband history. He feels constantly that those, the triumphs of settler society in faraway Australia, establishing a democratic state, was constantly overlooked, and that now we feel too guilty about that past and too inclined to see its negatives. So I guess I'm answering your question in a broad way, feeling that in some ways the war, Second World War, does rule a line across his life, perhaps that country childhood, perhaps those simpler times that he's celebrating, and also, of course, it threw Australia into a very different geopolitical environment, and that is where he ends The Tyranny of Distance. I feel that last chapter reminds us that this is in many ways a cobbled together book, as Geoffrey Blainey admits himself, that he wrote that second half first as a history of transport, and then he realised that before describing how people conquered distance, he should explain the challenges of distance and the peculiar isolation of Australia. So he writes the first half of the book to explain that. I think the first half is the best half. And then he finishes, probably I think the writing is quite swift and fast, with an essay about the Antipodes Adrift, where he rapidly brings it up to the post-war period. It's not, some of the critics at the time were quite tough on that last chapter about the Antipodes Adrift and felt that Blainey was a little bit out of his depth there. But I can see what he's trying to do is to really bring the exploration of distance into the present, his present, not just in terms of technology, but in terms of Australia's place on the globe as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. He gets a lot of criticism, of course, for his treatment of Indigenous people, which I know he goes on to correct. Perhaps you'll tell us a little bit more about that. But I remember Robert Hughes's Fatal Shore, for similar reasons, was assailed for not dealing seriously with the Indigenous experience of colonisation. What's the response to that criticism?
Well, there are few Indigenous peoples mentioned in The Tyranny of Distance, and though when they are mentioned, they're mentioned in a fairly dismissive way. However, this is a book written in the early to mid 1960s that was absolutely typical of the writing of Australian history at that time. John Larno's, the great professor of history, in 1959 talked about Aboriginal history as being a melancholy anthropological footnote to Australian history. That's 1959. That's just 7 years before Blainey's book's published. And Ernest Scott, who wrote his short history of Australia during the First World War, that book was taught in schools and at university for about the next 50 years. And it said that he began his history of Australia with a blank space on the map, meaning the continent was empty for Europeans to possess, and ended it with a new name written on that map, which was Anzac. So that was Ernest Scott's history of Australia. That was the kind of history of Australia that dominated in the first half of the 20th century. It was a history that was caught in the thrall of the Great Australian Silence, as W.E.H. Stanner, the anthropologist, called it. This inability to really see that this continent had been for so long occupied, possessed, loved by Aboriginal peoples. And what's striking is that Geoffrey Blainey, really very soon after publishing The Tyranny of Distance, himself reflected that he'd overlooked the Aboriginal experience. So in the late 1960s, he's working closely with his good friend John Mulvaney, the archaeologist, and he's aware that discoveries at Lake Mungo of ancient human skeletons are being found. Rhys Jones, the anthropologist, is doing exciting field work in Northern Australia and making some fascinating insights into the environmental management of Aboriginal people over millennia. And Blainey is absolutely alert to this. And he's the first historian who really steps out and embraces that new vista of ancient Australia and turns it into a compelling narrative. And so possibly, if I were to choose one book of Blainey's to discuss as a great book, I might have said Triumph of the Nomads, because there it doesn't have a cobbled together feel about it at all. It's a coherently, fluently written, a bold narrative where he opens our eyes to the great human drama of the rising of the seas at the end of the last ice age, that humans on this continent lived through that they saw volcanoes in the Western District of Victoria erupting, that they managed the environment in very sophisticated ways. So Blainey is writing these new insights straight into history, into his book Triumph of the Nomads in 1975. So he more than makes up for the absence, if you like, of Aboriginal people in The Tyranny of Distance by writing a whole book about Aboriginal Australia. And it's, for those of you who are interested, it's a really, it's a gripping read, and it's still one of the best entrees, if you like, to understanding the great drama of the deep history of Australia. And what Blainey did, if you think of the Ernest Scott style of history that he would have learned himself, that's a history where, and at universities where Australian history would have been the last lecture of the year in a course on British history. So you might study British history and you would finish it with the British colonisation of Australia, bringing it home. Well, Blainey, in his Triumph of the Nomads, he writes a whole book about Aboriginal Australia, and he finishes it with just the last few pages, the arrival of European ships offshore. So it's that is a truly radical history, I think, and probably his greatest book.
Thank you. I've got a question from Maxine McHugh. Maxine, please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thanks. Tom, first of all, thank you very much for, I think, a very fair lecture about the book that you still sound quite ambivalent about. Look, I want to say that I came to the book with very few expectations. It's my first reading. And I must say, I agree with you about the first part. I think the first part of this book is certainly close to carrying the label of a great book. And for this reason, I mean, I don't think I've read anything that captures the boldness, the thrill, the danger of that enterprise of the 18th and 19th century. We go from the sailing ships to the American clippers to the steamships, and it's just a terrific narrative. And every page I'm turning, I'm thinking this was the life of my great-grandparents in choosing which route and how long it would take to get to Australia and what was the cheapest fare. And of course, I realised when I got to the chapter that Blainey writes about assisted migration, as he points out, Queensland was the last colony to get rid of assisted migration, which probably explains why my great-grandmother ended up in Brisbane and not somewhere else. So I guess for those reasons, I can't think, and this is, I guess, my question, is there any other comparable Australian historian who has captured that moment in our history in quite that way?
Thank you, Maxine. I'm so pleased you've made that comment, because I think that's absolutely right. I think that is one of the things that really attracts us to this book. And again, on reading it, I felt just as you did. I felt like I was stepping onto those clipper ships. You know, I could feel and hear the wind in those sails, and see the see the ferocious southern sea through which they sailed. So it was. I've always loved that dimension of Blainey's work, his ability to really bring the sensory past to life. We can see the colours, we can smell the air, we can feel that we're almost there. And that's an enormous gift that he has. And your question is there anything comparable to that? Well, I think of the period, it's hard to think of anyone in that period writing as brilliantly as he is about that experience, the immigrants' experience. There are many fine scholarly works, but you don't feel the wind in your hair when you read them. But I think there are now wonderful examples that we might think of about what it is like to arrive in this strange place in the other end of the world and encounter a very unusual environment and Indigenous peoples. And I mentioned Grace Carskin's work, The Colony. That, in my view, is one of the great histories, published in 2009. I recommend you might like to try reading that, because it's a history of early Sydney, and it's an example of a new type of history that's appeared, I think, in the last 10 or 20 or 30 years. It's a history of settler Australia, but with new dimensions. Settler Australia encountering complex Aboriginal societies with whom they engage, and engage on a very, challenging way. In other words, there is war on the frontier, and there's also a good deal of learning going on by both cultures. And the other dimension of those histories is that we have a much keener sense now in the history to write of the diversity of the Australian environments that settlers encountered. And Blainey was a pioneer of environmental sensibilities, but more of environmental forces than of environmental ecology. So you see perhaps the colours and sounds of the land, but you don't learn as much as we do now, about the varieties of those environments, the distinctive ecologies, and the way in which they shaped the human cultures here in the past and now. So, yeah, I think I think historians tend to be good writers, and I think Blainey was unusual in his generation with his flair. But I think there are many fine writers now.
Yes, I have a bias here, because as a political scientist, I can't possibly concede that historians are better stylists than social scientists, but I might give you some ground there, Tom. Tom, one of the most, what I was struck, I read this book 10 years ago when I was contemplating emigration to a country I'd never been to before, Australia. And what struck me when I read it again, was how remarkable, from such inauspicious beginnings, a dumping ground for the detritus of British society, a remarkable society, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but a remarkable society and economy and people and culture and cultures was created from this really rather unpromising beginning. And the book captures that in a way that you don't often hear, unless you read The Australian. It's not part of fashionable academic intellectual discourse. And I'm not suggesting it should replace that discourse, but it's an important part of the Australian story that is too often ignored or ridiculed. I wonder if you had thoughts about that.
Well, thanks, Tim. My response to that would be to say that for much of the period leading up to the 1960s, that's what Australian history was. It was triumphant. It was celebrating the achievements. It was full of an optimism about what had been achieved so quickly in this faraway place from unpromising beginnings, that the story of the transformation of a penal colony into an advanced democratic society in such a short time was what Australian history was about. And that story remains, I think, one that we should draw great strength from. But one of the frustrations of the sort of culture wars is this feeling that if you suggest alternative histories, that it's one or the other. And Blainey himself often suggests this, his black armband stuff is all about that. That just because you are able now to tell a much more challenging and indeed traumatic history of Aboriginal Australia, or a very disturbing one about environmental degradation in the last 200 years, because you're telling those stories, that it somehow cancels out the other story. That's not so at all. We're not that simple-minded, really. We can live with a few thoughts in our minds at once. And indeed, good history is about complexity. The more complex the past is, the more real it is, isn't it? We know from our own lives that our own lives are complex. Our own society at this very moment is almost beyond our understanding. It is so complex. We would hope historians of the future would at least pay us the respect for being able to hold lots of different notions in our minds at once about our predicament at this moment. And it's true of the past that we can be proud about the political and social achievements of the Australian colonies and of the Commonwealth of Australia, at the same time as being able to observe and indeed analyse the fact that our nation is founded on violence and dispossession, and that our environmental story is a miserable one in terms of its impact on nature and sustainability, and these are issues we have to be able to discuss at the same time as celebrating what's been achieved. But I guess we're talking about this because Blainey himself does tend to use those metaphors, the balance sheet, one side or the other, the pendulum, again, from one side to another, the seesaw, it's up or down. And these are simplifying metaphors. They're very powerful communication strategies, but they tend to polarize.
And of course, I don't think Blainey would trade on being a victim of this new orthodoxy. In fact, in some ways, he would see it as a validation. I mean, this allows him to be controversialist. Very important self-perception that I see in his writing and in his public performances. In some ways, he gets a lot of the flack, less for politically incorrect history than for his infamous Warrnambool speech, his anti-immigrant, anti-Asian immigration speech. How do we factor that into his scholarship, into his biography? Is it appropriate to use that episode to colour his scholarly output?
I think it was a watershed in his political and scholarly life in 1984 when he made that speech about Asian immigration, and he felt that it was being really sort of secretly encouraged by the government to an extent that would push the sort of tolerance of ordinary Australians for whom he felt he was the voice. And there was a huge storm. There was the Twitter storm of the time in the newspapers and the media about his comments, and he fought back, and he fought back strongly, but he was hurt and wounded, and I think that has unquestionably influenced his life. I think it's one of the reasons he's hesitant about extending his biography at the moment, his memoir beyond about 1970. If he writes volume 2, he's going to have to again move into territory which he knows is difficult. But I think it's important we use that event to make sense of his life. It alerts us to certain habits of mind and argument that we can discern even in Tyranny of Distance. This tendency to create straw people that enable you to demolish them and then seem perhaps to be more original than you might be, and his tendency in the debates following the Tyranny of Distance was to not give ground at all, really, not to allow to defend his territory quite vociferously. And I think it's clear that he enjoys a controversy. He's gone after controversy. He has facilitated it. He's a contrarian. You can't be a contrarian without, I think, courting controversy. And I guess in my lecture, I was trying to see what are the advantages and disadvantages of being a contrarian in intellectual life. I think it's been hugely advantageous to Geoffrey Blainey, and it has really enabled him to say, offer us many new insights, but it has cornered him in various ways that saddened me, really.
Peter McPhee, you wanted to come back in there.
Just to make a comment about that, if I may, Tom. I went back to the copy of the book that I'd bought when I was an undergraduate and found that I'd stuck in the back of it, as one does, an interview that Blainey had given in 1988 during the bicentenary, where he was asked about the great controversy of 1984, the Warrnambool speech and so on. And he, as he often does, Geoffrey Blainey expressed puzzlement. He said, "I don't understand why people got so angry with me, because I was really only saying what I said in A Tyranny of Distance." Of course, what had happened in the meantime, and I think this is another war which is very important in understanding Geoffrey Blainey, is the end of the Vietnam War, where in the early 1980s there'd been massive Vietnamese refugee movement into Australia, and there was indeed a fair amount of racial tension that I recall very well. And I remember I was at that time teaching in New Zealand, and Geoffrey Blainey visited the campus, the university I was at the very time in 1984 when things had all blown up. And it was he talked about it very much in the context of the divisions that had been occasioned by the end of the Vietnam War and the influx of Vietnamese boat people, refugees into Australia. So I think that one of the reasons why that Warrnambool speech made such an impact was that, in fact, there were quite heightened tensions at the time that he made that. I know that in the history department, where people got so cross with him, one of the other historians there had an Asian partner and was particularly upset that such an eminent historian was seen to be making remarks like this on behalf of the history profession. But I do think that the aftermath of the Vietnam War is significant as context for that controversy in 1984.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, so Blainey talks about this period as the counterculture, the 1960s, the time when, the late 1960s, when he really found that he was out of kilter with the sort of dynamic ideas of the age. And he wrote in the 1970s a book called The Great Seesaw, which was about swings of optimism and pessimism and fashions in Western society over 200 years. And he discerned again, a sort of a seesaw between polarities, between wilderness and the machine, between optimism and pessimism, between a love of technology and a love of nature. And he felt that the 1960s, with the Vietnam War and with changing attitudes to nature, the rise of the Green Movement, Aboriginal rights, that this was a turning away from technology towards nature and towards Indigenous peoples. And he was a historian of science and technology, and he felt in some ways stranded, I think, by that. And he wrote The Great Seesaw, which is a very interesting book, and I recommend it. I think he wrote that book partly to make sense of the destabilisation he felt he was experiencing at that time. He was, right through the 1950s and 60s, he chose to be an outsider in academia. Didn't he? He was our first public historian, I think. And I began my career as a public historian. I admired the kind of leadership, the example that Blainey gave in being a historian active in the public sphere and not only in universities. And he made his career as a commissioned writer outside universities. He came in belatedly to the university, but I think by 1984, his outsider status became forced upon him, really. It was no longer his chosen marginality. He became a pariah, really, sadly, in the university for many people. It was very divisive time. Many people who disagreed with him supported his right to say these things and lamented greatly that he was under so much attack, and they were fighting for his right to say what he was saying, even if they disagreed with it. Others felt that he was mobilising his expertise in service of a sort of populist prejudice, and they felt very unhappy about the results they could see in the streets from comments that he was making at the microphone and in editorials and feature pages of the paper. He wielded power. Manning Clark was also a historian who was political, and Manning Clark was, if you like, the court historian for the Whitlam and Hawke governments, and you might call Blainey the court historian for the Howard government. Certainly, he had opportunities given him by the Fraser government and the Howard government, and I think in 1984, Hawke government had come into power the year before. I think Blainey could have made the same comments in 1982. He made them in 1984 because he was being political, and he was very deliberately attacking the Hawke government administration of immigration, even though there was really bipartisanship on this issue in those years. So it was when Blainey stepped out from behind the scholarly role and more overtly became a politician.
Thank you.
Tom, Ian Marshman has made this comment, which I think is an important one. He says, what's most interesting is just how much this particular great book session has been about the author rather than the book itself. It suggests to me, he says, that this is more about an influential author rather than a great book. On the other hand, had the Tyranny of Distance not been written by Geoffrey Blainey, would it have appeared in this series?
Oh, what a great question, Ian. Yes, that's a really challenging one to think through. If it had been a lone book by another author and there wasn't the whole oeuvre to deal with, it would certainly be less interesting to talk about, and it would be seen, I think, to be a book that quickly the world passed by in many ways, because it wasn't ahead of its time, it was of its time. And it was, in a way, a culminating synthesis about the world that was about to disappear. The world that even, I think in the final pages of the book, Blainey himself senses is changing and begins to lament its passing. So it's a bit elegiac in that sense about that world. And so would it have? Well, I think it has flaws, structural flaws, as a book alone, considered alone, that would make it hard to justify as a great book. I really do believe that, because, and I think Geoffrey would see that himself. He explained to us how it came about. It's a book which is an upside down book. It is, if it were just the history of transport, and how conventional is that history for a start, to be writing a history of transport? You know, that's the fact that he made a history of transport, a book that, 60 years later, we're still talking about, or 55 years later, we're still talking about, is incredible. And he did it because he was, and is, a gifted writer. He has this brilliant ability to link the minutiae of daily life and material life to great forces in world history. And maybe this is to return to your opening question, Tim, this is another claim for greatness for the book, I think, is to say that this is the historian who most, and in some ways it is drawing on Maxine's question too, this is the historian who is the best historian still today, I think we could say, of our material life. So we know in the French greatly admire Fernand Braudel and the Annales school of material life in French society, and we might similarly admire Geoffrey Blainey as our Australian pioneer of la longue durée, of deep time, of long-term perspectives on society, and as our historian of material life. Blainey brings the inanimate to life. He makes those clipper ships, he makes those steamships and those bullock drays. He brings them alive. We can see them working. We can understand how they work. I love the way in the whaling chapter, he doesn't just talk about whaling as an industry. He takes us on board those boats and ships and into that broiling sea, and makes us understand, helps us to understand, to see how the industry worked, how you caught such a mammoth beast, how you flensed it, how you could make a living out of it, what it smelt like to live and work in those conditions. That's a historian of material life, and I think that Tyranny of Distance is really the first of his books that declares his great ability in that regard.
This is called empathetic relativism, is it not? The notion that historical method, as far as possible, should try and place the historian in the role that they are describing. Is that a fair way of describing what Blainey's method is? Yes,
and I think that's the game that all historians try to play, which is that we set ourselves and the reader in the context of the time as much as we can, without hindsight. And then when we choose, and Blainey does this too, we step out of that time and make modern parallels, and we ask questions from hindsight. And we use both of those lenses to try and open up the past to our study. And but yeah, Blainey's good at both of them. One of the reasons he's such a popular author is that he can speak to the reader's context as well as represent the context of the past so vividly. He's he's enacting that dialogue between the past and the present, which is what creates good history.
Maxine, you wanted to come back in? Maxine McHugh. You're muted, Maxine.
Okay, can you hear me now?
That's great.
Tom, just as you were talking there, it's just starting to, I suppose what's going off in my head is that perhaps Blainey is a very good economic historian. And part of, again, what makes Tyranny of Distance, I think, alive for me is that he gets commerce. He likes commerce. He thrills to that. He appreciates the enterprise, the grit of those early settlers. And of course, as we went through the 70s and 80s, that was not particularly popular. I mean, you know, I came through a period where everyone I knew valorized, if you like, Manning Clark, and certainly in the wake of 84, demonized Blainey. But I'm, you know, I mean, now we know in the light of, say, Mark McKenna's book, Manning Clark lied about the central animating principle of his life. That was a bit of a shock. And I look at Blainey now and think, well, did he just not, perhaps he was someone who fell foul of fashion, and he was very popular. Not all academics like popularity. And he was, you say, prepared to be a contrarian. He followed his own road, and that was very much, as I say, to be, I think, an economic historian, taking the commissions from corporations, that sort of thing. I can see those sort of things would not have sat well with the academy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to, could I just come in on Maxine's point there? Because it's a question that Robert asks. Do you think he could get a job at a university today?
Oh, yes. Yes. Yes, he would. I mean, such a brilliant teacher and writer. And he certainly would get a job today, I believe. I think his skills would be greatly appreciated as much today as they were then. But he would even today, he would probably also take an independent way. He is a maverick, and as Maxine's observed, he's primarily an economic historian, someone who kind of refined his skills in writing company histories, and he deals with economic forces and conditions and statistics with literary flair, which is amazing because there are quite a few statistics throughout Tyranny of Distance, aren't there? But it's communicated to the reader as, 1 in 10 people, or in phrases that enable you to immediately understand what he's talking about. He doesn't use graphs or throw statistics at you. He just informs his analysis and his narrative with them. But he is his passion for economic forces, for understanding the flow of commodities, the way trade works, the way he just simply explains to us, for example, why wool and gold were commodities that could triumph over distance. These are the kind of obvious things that no one else either saw or were able to explain so well. And so Blainey loves explaining the obvious. And when, in some cases, his reviewers said, well, I think he's just stating the obvious, I can almost hear him chuckling. I think that's exactly what he's aiming to do. He's trying to ferret out the very things that are under our feet, before our very eyes. I once came across a story he told about his, as a 15-year-old boy, he got an opportunity to work on his uncle's farm in Gembrook, and his job was to follow the plough and pick up the loose potatoes that had been forgotten and unobserved and left behind by the potato harvesters a month or two before. And so his job was to gather the forgotten loose golden potatoes in the wake of others, the tripping that others might not notice at their very feet. And that's in a way what he's done in history. He finds the gold that is staring you in the face and that others somehow didn't see or didn't feel was worth commenting upon.
Tom, it's been an absolute delight this evening to spend time in your company and your wonderful refraction and reflection on an extraordinary Australian writer, Geoffrey Blainey, and a really terrific book, which I count as great, in a body of work which remains considerable. I think you made an excellent case for that. Can I, on behalf of everyone at Great Books, thank you for the time and effort you put into your presentation and in your very thoughtful and considered comments this evening. We're all extremely grateful, and we look forward in the future to having you back to take on some of the other books that were in your initial list of suggestions, because there are many good ones there. So Tom, thank you. Can I remind everyone in the group that next month we are going to jump a few thousand years back and deal with Aristotle's Neo-Machian ethics with Professor Margaret Cameron. And we will adopt the same format. I mean, please God, we can't expect the lockdown to be lifted then. So I would imagine us meeting in the same place, your living room and my study, or wherever you are, and we'll consider Aristotle in our August session. Thank you very much. Live well, stay safe. Good evening.